It was supposed to be the best night of the summer. Two best friends, a car full of music, and the open road. Neither one of them made it home. And the man responsible for what happened to them wasn't some drifter passing through town. He was someone people knew. Someone people trusted. Someone who spent the next 20 years living completely out in the open, right in the middle of the community where he committed the worst crime of his life. This is the story of Ashley Monroe and her best friend, Kayla Simmons, two 17-year-old girls from Dothan, Alabama, who vanished on the night of July 31st, 1999, and were found the next morning in the trunk of a car. It is the story of a DNA sample that sat in a lab for 2 full decades because nobody in any database matched it. And it is the story of how one police chief, refusing to give up on two families who had been waiting since before the year 2000, used a technology that didn't even exist when the crime was committed to finally put a name to that DNA. I need you to understand something before we go any further. This case is not just a mystery. It is not just a puzzle to solve. It is the story of two real mothers who spent 24 years waking up every single morning without answers. I want you to keep that in mind as we walk through everything that happened, because every twist in this case, every dead end, every failed lead, every year that passed without resolution, was another year those two women had to carry something nobody should ever have to carry. Let's start from the beginning. The summer of 1999 was one of those summers that feels eternal when you're 17. The economy was booming, the internet was still new and exciting, and in small southern towns like Dothan, Alabama, life moved at the kind of pace where you knew your neighbors by name and thought nothing of letting your teenager go out on a Friday night. Dothan was that kind of place. A city of about 60,000 people tucked down in the southeastern corner of Alabama near the Florida and Georgia borders, known for its peanut farms, its tight-knit neighborhoods, and its community events. Nobody had reason to be afraid there. Not really. Not yet. Ashley Monroe was turning 17 on July 31st. Born in 1982, she was the kind of daughter parents brag about without embarrassment. Honor roll, cheerleading squad, the Junior Honor Society, and a smile that her mother, Diane Monroe, said could light up whatever room she walked into. Kayla Simmons had been Ashley's best friend since they were in middle school. They were the kind of friends who finished each other's sentences, who showed up to every event together, who were basically impossible to think of as separate people. If you saw one, the other was usually somewhere in the frame. That night, Ashley's birthday, the two girls left Dothan in Ashley's black Mazda 929 just after 10 in the evening. They were heading to a party about 10 miles north in a neighboring town called Headland. A summer party in a field. Music, friends, the whole thing. Neither one of them had been drinking. Neither one of them had any reason to be worried. They were just two teenagers going to a birthday party on a warm Alabama night. But somewhere along the way, they made a wrong turn. Then another. And before they knew it, they were in Ozark, a town more than 20 miles in the wrong direction, completely off course from where they needed to be. Just after 11:30 at night, Ashley pulled the Mazda into the parking lot of a small convenience store on East Broad Street in Ozark. The store itself had already closed for the night, but a woman named Sandra Tillman happened to be there with her daughter, picking up a couple of sodas from the outdoor machine. Ashley and Kayla got out of the car and asked for directions back to Highway 231 so they could find their way home. Sandra gave them clear directions, recalled later that both girls looked neat, calm, no signs of distress, just two teenagers who had gotten a little lost and were ready to get home. Nothing seemed wrong. Nothing seemed off. There was a payphone on the corner of the store. Kayla walked over to it and called her mother. Her mom, Patricia Simmons, picked up and heard her daughter's voice, totally normal. Not scared, not rushing. Kayla said they had gotten a little lost, but they had directions now, and they were on their way home. Then she said, "Mom, I love you. Be home soon." And she hung up. Sandra Tillman stood in that parking lot and watched the black Mazda pull out onto the road, turn right exactly as she had directed, and disappear into the dark. That was the last time anyone saw Ashley Monroe or Kayla Simmons alive. There was something else in that parking lot that night that nobody paid attention to at the time. The store's security camera, grainy, fixed angle, the kind that records everything in a low-resolution blur, had captured an image of a small white pickup truck parked at the gas pump at the exact moment Kayla was on the phone with her mother. No transaction was ever recorded at that pump. Nobody saw the driver. The truck's license plate was unreadable in the footage. 4 years after that night, that white pickup truck would be one of the most haunting unsolved details in the entire case. On the morning of August 1st, 1999, Both families reported the girls missing after they hadn't come home all night. That same morning, less than a mile from that payphone, Ashley's black Mazda was found parked on a residential street called Herring Avenue. Police came to check it out. On the surface, the car looked fine. No crash damage, no signs it had been forced off the road, nothing violent. Just a car sitting on the side of the road like someone had parked it and walked away. But the details told a different story. The car was caked in mud. The gas tank was nearly empty, even though the girls had just left from a town with gas stations. The driver's window was rolled down a few inches. The doors were unlocked. Ashley's driver's license was sitting on the dashboard. Both girls' wallets were still in the car, along with cash, jewelry, and credit cards. The only thing missing was a small keychain Ashley always carried, white and black letters that spelled out the phrase, "hard to get." Ozark police looked at the Dothan plates and contacted Dothan detectives. A Dothan investigator arrived at the scene. The car had been sitting there since around 8 in the morning. 6 hours passed. Nobody opened the trunk. It wasn't until early afternoon, while waiting on a tow truck, that the investigator discovered the trunk could be popped from a lever inside the cabin without a key. He leaned in and pulled the lever. The trunk opened. Ashley Monroe and Kayla Simmons were inside. Each had been shot once in the head with a 9mm handgun. Both girls were still fully clothed. There were no obvious signs of a physical struggle in the car, but their bodies told the story that the car couldn't. Kayla had scratches on her arm. There were briars stuck to her pants. Her brand new shoes, bought just days before, were caked in mud. Both girls had wet pant legs up to their knees. They had been somewhere outside, somewhere with damp ground or tall grass, before they were killed. From the way they were positioned in the trunk, it was clear Kayla had been placed in first, and Ashley after her. A 9mm shell casing was resting on Kayla's leg. Robbery was ruled out immediately. All the cash, jewelry, and cards were still there. These girls had not been killed on Herring Avenue. That was just where the killer had left them. The initial autopsy found no evidence of rape and no alcohol or drugs in either girl's system. But more than 2 months later, the Alabama State Crime Lab came back with a finding that changed everything. Biological evidence was recovered from Ashley's clothing and skin. The forensic and physical evidence made it clear that a sexual assault had occurred. The district attorney said it publicly and plainly. This was a sexual crime, and finding the source of that biological evidence meant finding the killer. An unidentified palm print was also lifted from the inside of the trunk lid. 2 pieces of physical evidence, both pointing to one person, and neither one matching anyone in any database. Dothan was shaken in a way that small cities rarely recover from quickly. These weren't strangers. This was a 17-year-old girl on her birthday and her best friend, found in the trunk of a car 2 miles from a payphone where she had just told her mother she was on her way home. People looked at each other on the street differently after that. They wondered. They questioned. The reward fund climbed. The pressure on investigators was enormous. Then, exactly 1 month after the bodies were discovered, a man walked into the police station on his own. His name was Derek Barstow, 28 years old, a part-time mechanic who lived less than a mile from Herring Avenue. On September 1st, 1999, he came forward and said he had information about what happened that night. The interrogation went on for 4 hours and was fully recorded. In those 4 hours, Barstow told 6 different versions of events. In the first version, he had seen a black truck speeding away from the Herring Avenue area. Then it was a stranger with tattoos who had been near the store that night. Then it became a story where the tattooed man had gotten into Ashley's car in the parking lot, told Barstow to follow them, drove them to Herring Avenue, pulled the girls from the car, and Barstow heard 2 gunshots before driving the man home. Police arrested him. The press covered it heavily. The community exhaled. People thought it was over. It wasn't over. In every single version of his story, Barstow never once mentioned any sexual activity, even though the forensic evidence had already confirmed it happened. The man he identified as the tattooed stranger had a rock-solid alibi for the entire night. And when the DNA results came back, they matched neither Barstow nor the man he had accused. Barstow eventually appeared before a grand jury and admitted he had invented the entire story to collect the reward money. He hadn't been there. He hadn't seen anything. He knew nothing. The grand jury declined to indict him. He walked out. And the case didn't just go back to square one. It was worse than that, because investigators had spent months chasing a fabricated story while the real killer went untouched. Over the next several years, police pursued other leads. A man from Michigan who had been in the area that night couldn't account for a 3 to 4 hour window and had left town shortly after the murders. Investigators flew to Michigan 3 times to question him. The DNA didn't match. A man from Mississippi who had been staying in Ozark and disappeared right after the killings was brought in for questioning and testing. The DNA didn't match. The white pickup truck from the security camera footage was never identified. Its driver was never found. Every lead hit a wall. Every wall led to nothing. The DNA was the only piece of evidence that still had any real value, and it matched nobody in any database in the state of Alabama. The years passed. Then the decades. The 2000s came and went. The 2010s. Dothan changed the way all cities change. New neighborhoods, new businesses, new faces. Children who were born after 1999 grew up and had no memory of Ashley Monroe or Kayla Simmons except as names mentioned quietly by adults. Life moved forward. But for Diane Monroe and Patricia Simmons, it didn't move forward. It accumulated. Year after year, July 31st came around, and those 2 women relived every moment of that night. The phone call. The voice. The words, "I love you, be home soon." The car turning right into the darkness and never coming back. Every year, the same wound reopened. Every year, still no name, still no answers, still no justice. The case file stayed officially open at the Ozark Police Department. The DNA sample was carefully stored, maintained, waiting. But waiting for what? Nobody knew, because the technology to match it didn't exist yet. In April of 2018, nearly 20 years after that night, the entire country was focused on a stunning arrest in Sacramento, California. A man named Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, responsible for at least 13 murders and more than 50 sexual assaults across California during the 70s and 80s, had been identified and arrested after more than 4 decades on the run. He had no criminal record in any law enforcement database. He had lived quietly in a suburb, retired and invisible. Nobody had ever come close to catching him through traditional investigation. And yet there he was, in handcuffs, identified through something that had never been used in American criminal justice before: genetic genealogy. The technique worked like this. Instead of running crime scene DNA through law enforcement databases, which only contain samples from people who have been arrested and convicted, investigators uploaded the DNA to public genealogy sites where millions of ordinary people had voluntarily submitted their own samples to trace their ancestry. The crime scene DNA didn't have to match the killer directly. It just had to match distant relatives. From those partial matches, investigators built family trees, generation by generation, branch by branch, until they narrowed down to a single individual who fit all the other known criteria. The technology didn't find the killer. It found his family. And then it found him. The Ozark police chief, a man named Marcus Holloway, had been following the Golden State Killer case closely, not just as a spectator, but as someone with a specific reason to pay attention. Because sitting in his department's evidence storage was a DNA sample collected from Ashley Monroe's body in 1999, a sample that had never matched anyone. 2 mothers who were still waiting. And a killer who, for all he knew, was still alive and still free. Chief Holloway contacted Parabon Nanolabs, the private forensic company that had been central to identifying DeAngelo, and asked them to run the 1999 sample through the public genealogy databases. Find the families in Alabama with DNA similar to this sample. Build the family trees. Narrow it down. Parabon ran the analysis. The results came back with a list of Alabama families whose DNA shared measurable markers with the crime scene sample. Chief Holloway went through the list. And he stopped at a name he recognized. A name from his own school days. A name from the community he had spent his career protecting. The name was Calvin McCready, 45 years old. Born and raised in the Dothan, Ozark area. A long-haul truck driver. A husband. A father of 2 children. A pastor at a local church. And a man with absolutely no criminal record, no prior police contact, nothing in 20 years that would have ever connected him to the case. In the community, Calvin McCready was a familiar face, a man neighbors waved to from their driveways, a man his congregation respected and trusted, a man you might have seen at the grocery store, or the hardware store, or the gas station and thought nothing of. Nobody had ever looked at Calvin McCready and seen a killer. That was precisely why his DNA had never been in any database. Holloway did not approach him as a suspect. He was smarter than that. Instead, he invited McCready to the station as a community member who might be able to help identify the real person they were looking for. A friendly conversation between two men who had known each other since their school days. Holloway told McCready directly, "You're not a suspect, but I need your DNA so we can rule people out and close in on who actually did this." McCready's wife, Renee, sat beside him during that meeting. She had no reason to suspect her husband of anything. She encouraged him to cooperate. McCready agreed. An officer swabbed the inside of his cheek. He sat there calmly, unaware that Parabon Nanolabs had already built the family tree that pointed directly to him before he ever walked into that building. The results came back with no ambiguity whatsoever. Calvin McCready's DNA was a match for the biological evidence recovered from Ashley Monroe's body on August 1, 1999. The sample that had been sitting in a lab for 20 years. The sample that had outlasted 2 decades of failed leads, fabricated confessions, and cold silence. When investigators confronted McCready with the results, he denied everything. He said he didn't know Ashley Monroe or Kayla Simmons. He said he had never met them. He said he was not in Ozark on the night of July 31, 1999. On March 15, 2019, nearly 20 years to the day after the black Mazda turned right out of that parking lot and never came back, Calvin McCready was arrested on multiple counts of capital murder and rape. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. The shock that moved through Dothan and Ozark after that arrest was not the shock of a mystery being solved. It was something more complicated and more painful than that. It was the slow, suffocating realization that the man who had killed those 2 girls had spent the 20 years since the crime living right there among them. Going to work, attending church, standing at the pulpit, raising his children, aging normally, being a recognized face in the community. While Diane Monroe and Patricia Simmons sat in their homes waiting for answers that never came, Calvin McCready was living a full life 45 minutes away. When Patricia Simmons heard the name, she couldn't speak for several minutes. When Diane Monroe heard it, she cried. Not from relief. There was no relief. There was only the old pain resurfacing with a new shape, and a fragile new hope that the trial ahead might finally give them the answers they had been denied for 2 decades. The trial was originally set for 2020, but the pandemic delayed it. It didn't begin until April of 2023, 24 years after the night it all happened. McCready, now 49, sat at the defense table facing 4 counts of capital murder and 1 count of rape. The trial lasted 8 days. Dozens of witnesses, physical evidence, forensic testimony, and 2 mothers seated in the front row on the side reserved for victims' families, present for every single moment of it. McCready chose to take the stand himself, a major risk in any criminal trial, because once a defendant testifies, the prosecution gets to cross-examine them directly. And on that stand, he told a story that was completely different from the total denial he had offered in 2019. Now he said he had met Ashley at a shopping mall in Dothan a few months before the crime. She had introduced herself by a different name. They had exchanged numbers, stayed in contact, and arranged to meet in Ozark that night. He said his truck had broken down at a gas station due to a bad alternator. He said he ran into Ashley and Kayla at the payphone by coincidence, that the girls offered him a ride to where his truck was parked, and that he and Ashley had consensual sex in his truck cab. He said the girls drove him home around 12:45 in the morning, and he had no idea what happened to them after that. As for why he had completely denied ever knowing them when he was first arrested, denied it flatly and without hesitation, he said he had been afraid his wife would find out about the affair. The prosecution took that story apart piece by piece. There was not a single piece of evidence, no texts, no calls, no records, no witnesses, to support the claim that Ashley Monroe and Calvin McCready had ever met before that night. Sandra Tillman, the woman who had been in that parking lot when the girls stopped for directions, took the stand and was clear. Ashley and Kayla were lost and trying to get home. There was no indication of a planned meeting. No sign of recognition. No sign that they knew anyone there. And Kayla's phone call to her mother at 11:35 confirmed it. They were on their way home. Not to a rendezvous. The prosecution laid out what the forensic and physical evidence actually showed. After the Mazda left the parking lot that night, McCready had approached the car, held both girls at gunpoint, forced them to follow him to another location, somewhere with brush and wet ground, which explained the mud on their shoes and the water on their pants, assaulted Ashley, then shot both girls with a 9mm handgun, placed their bodies in the trunk, drove the car to Herring Avenue and left it there. But the most devastating moment of the entire trial came from a witness that nobody on the defense side had anticipated being quite so damaging. Renee McCready, Calvin's wife. The woman who had sat beside him in 2019 when police asked for his DNA. The woman who had encouraged him to cooperate because she had no reason to think he had anything to hide. The woman who had trusted him for over 20 years. She took the witness stand and testified that her husband had gone out on the night of July 31st, 1999, and had never given her a satisfactory explanation for where he had been or how long he was gone. His wife, testifying against him. The weight of that moment filled the courtroom in a way that no piece of forensic evidence could replicate. On April 25, 2023, after 8 days of testimony, the jury went to deliberate. The following day, they came back. Guilty on all 4 counts. The murder of Ashley Monroe during the commission of rape. The murder of Kayla Simmons during the same criminal event. The murder of both victims in the same course of conduct. And the use of Ashley's vehicle as part of the criminal act. A provision under Alabama law that qualifies as capital murder when a victim's own property is used in the commission of the crime against them. The jury then convened again to decide the sentence. They returned with their decision. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Calvin McCready, 49 years old, would never leave prison. Not in 5 years. Not in 20. Not ever. When the verdict was read, Patricia Simmons sat in that courtroom and couldn't speak. She said afterward, "I'm stunned. We waited 24 years, and finally someone is being held accountable." Diane Monroe leaned forward and broke down crying. Not quietly, not composed. Just completely and totally undone in a way that only comes after you've held something in for longer than most people can imagine. Alabama's Attorney General, who had personally prosecuted the case, stood before the press and said they had lost 2 precious girls who never got the chance to grow up and experience life. He acknowledged that no verdict could give those families what they truly wanted, but it could answer the question that had been waiting for 24 years. Calvin McCready is currently incarcerated at a correctional facility in Bessemer, Alabama. In a phone interview from prison, he continued to maintain his innocence, saying people could call him whatever they wanted, but he didn't kill anyone. The DNA said otherwise. The jury said otherwise. And 2 mothers who spent a quarter of a century waiting for that answer said otherwise with the tears they cried when the word guilty was finally spoken out loud. This case was one of the first in the United States to demonstrate that genetic genealogy could solve a cold case under the most difficult possible conditions. No criminal record, no reliable witnesses, and no physical evidence except a single DNA sample stored in a lab for 20 years. After the McCready conviction, hundreds of cold cases across the country were reopened using the same approach. Families who had accepted that they would never know the truth suddenly received phone calls they had long since stopped daring to hope for. There is a practical side to this story too, something that goes beyond the investigation and the courtroom. Ashley and Kayla got lost that night. It was that simple. A wrong turn, and then another, and suddenly they were 20 miles from where they needed to be, stopped in a parking lot asking a stranger for directions at 11:30 at night. In 1999, that was just what you did when you got lost. You stopped. You asked. You trusted that most people were decent. Today, there is no reason to be that vulnerable. Tell someone exactly where you're going, not just the general area, not just a party, but the address, the host's name, a contact number. If plans change, update whoever is waiting for you. Turn on location, sharing on your phone with at least one person you trust completely. If you get lost after dark and you have to stop, stay in the car, lock the doors, and make your calls from there. And if something feels wrong, if a situation feels off in a way you can't fully articulate, trust that feeling. It exists for a reason. The most important thing this case teaches us is the one that is the hardest to accept. Dangerous people rarely look dangerous. Calvin McCready was a pastor. He was a father. He was a neighbor. He was the kind of person you would have nodded to at the hardware store without a second thought. Nobody suspected him because there was nothing about how he presented himself that gave anyone reason to. That is the reality. It is not a reason to live in fear, but it is a reason to pay attention, to trust your instincts, and to make sure the people you love always know where you are. Ashley Monroe should have turned 41 this year. Kayla Simmons too. They never got that chance. But their story, and the 2 mothers who refused to stop fighting for them for 24 years, is the reason a man who thought he had gotten away with it will die inside a prison cell. That matters. It doesn't fix anything, but it matters.